The truth of it is, it happens. And definitely with chronic illness, it's inevitable. And there are times where those dark moments seem to go on forever and ever and ever. And it can get really difficult to get motivated to keep going, keep pushing to make a change happen. So let's talk about that. I'm Lena Anderson, and my mission is to help you live well with chronic illness. So let's get going. So I'm going to get started with the real tea. Spill the tea. How did that saying even happen? Anyway, dark times, chronic illness. It happens to us all. Like, let's get real. Life is not a walk on roses. Well, I like to say that it is indeed a walk on roses because there's plenty of thorns. And when you have a chronic illness, there are a whole lot of those thorns. And they're not just I say, about chronic illness. It's, real life. It's grief, loss, pandemics, death, other types of illness, moving away from the people you love. There's so much, right? And then you add chronic illness to it, and dark times is, multiplied by a certain factor, probably doubled at least. And it can happen pretty frequently, and sometimes daily, and sometimes that daily hard time keeps going and going. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that one of my hardest times was my, big flare in 2004. It was a life-changing and life-threatening flare of rheumatoid arthritis that went on for almost a year. And it got so bad at a certain point that the only way I could get through it was to kind of set a time in my mind where it would be okay to stop trying, which is, a medical professional might say that I was suicidal, but I don't think I was. Sure, my thoughts involved suicide, but, and that was the plan I had. But it wasn't because I wanted to die. I wanted to not have pain anymore. I wanted to not be in the middle of this flare that has taken all my energy, that put me through unrelenting and quite terrifying pain every day that completely ate my life. And I could do nothing. I lost so much ability. I'm disabled now, right? But this was way more. I couldn't even face moving a couple of papers from my desk. If I had friends to come over, which they did, and I was grateful. But I always felt really bad when after half an hour, and I'm not kidding, half an hour, I said, I have no more energy. Thank you for visiting, but you got to go now. So I made a plan, and I said, okay, I'm going to give. I was waiting for a treatment. That's part of how I got so bad. I was waiting for funding for biologic. And I kind of told myself at a certain point towards the end of 2004 that I was going to give it until the summer, so June-ish. And if something hadn't changed, it would be okay to kill myself. And that's a really desperate thing to face. And thankfully, just a week into the new year, this funding came through. I got my biologic. I could feel it working very quickly, and my life changed. But I still kind of look back on that time and go, whoa. Well, one of my questions is, why didn't I tell my doctors how bad it was? But I think that's part of what this thing I'm talking about today is, because there are times when it gets so bad that you can't even think about what to do, right? So that's what we're talking about, how to get to the point where you go, I have to do something. But of course, your experience doesn't have to be that catastrophic in order for for things to feel unrelentingly crappy. And just a reminder, we don't play the comparison game around here because it tends to invalidate your feelings or make you feel better at the expense of judging somebody else. So, let's not play with that. It's about what happens in the context of your life. And if you're an athlete who suddenly can't run anymore, but can otherwise do the rest of your life, that's still unrelentingly crappy, right? So if you're used to cleaning your house on your own and now you can't, that's unrelentingly crappy. Like, it all counts. And it can be anything, right? That happens. Your much loved doctor decides to retire or move, and all of a sudden you're without this team member who's had your back for years. It can be a series of disappointments coming one after another, where every single one builds on the one that happened before, and it just keeps going, and you can feel your ability to cope eroding with everyone. It can be the never-ending exhaustion of the administrivia we all have to do as people with chronic illness, where we're wrangling healthcare, we're wrangling hand personalities within healthcare, we're wrangling service professionals like your insurance company, anybody who provides home care, or whatever, right? So it could be just a confluence of events that escalates and just builds in the impact. The point is, your feelings are valid, and you don't have to judge yourself. Not here. This is a safe space. So anyway, I just want to say hi to a couple of people in the comments. Hey, my mom's there. Say hi to my mom. Janet and Susie are there as well. Susie, yes, says sending some sunshine from California, and Lord, oh Lord, we need it. We have officially hit what I call minus plenty, which is like well below freezing and very cold. And we had a humdinger of a storm on Monday. I can't see your name, Susie. Thank you very much, because this is my public page, and that means you show up. For those of you who remember on my Facebook group called Lena's Couch, that's Lene. When I go live in there, because it's a private group, you don't see the name, so that's the whole thing. But just for those of you, because guess what? I'm trying the whole live on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. So if you're out there on YouTube, by all means join. Well, anyone really, if you're not on the couch, then join. I'll pop a link in the description, I think, of this post at the end, and we'll move from there. Anyway, so Barbara's also out there, and I'm going to get to you. I want to talk a little bit about coping in a minute, and while I answer some questions that have come in, let's, if you're comfortable, share an experience about a dark time in your life and how you coped. It might help someone else. Janet says, a very good point. I do think that hurting every single day causes a person to become just so very weary, of fighting. It's truly amazing how you can overcome so many times and still be here to help us so much. Thank you, Lena. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't even see. But I think, like, you know what? We all overcome all the time. Sometimes it's the daily, sometimes it's a big catastrophic thing, right? It's the resilience we have as people with chronic illness is truly earned the hard way, right? And Janet says, it's exhausting and hard to deal with. Every biologic drug I've been on has failed me. Next week, I go once again to see my rheumatologist. Yeah, that's rough, right? And finding, for me, the hardest thing about saying yes to a new drug is finding the courage to hope, right? Because it's not really, like, there's so much psychological involved in that. And there was a time in my life where I just said, I can't do this anymore, trying thing after thing that's not working. So I took a break. And then my life went belly up and I said, give me anything. So, it's a balancing act all the time. And Barbara sends hugs and hope. Thank you so much, Barbara. Anyway, so let's talk about coping. And to be honest, like as people with chronic illness in this community, and I've talked to a lot of people in this community, and we tend to minimize or dismiss our feelings. And that's not a bit wrong with what I called good old fashioned repression. Because if I didn't repress my feelings, I'd never get anything done, right? If I didn't repress my feelings, I'd curl up in a ball and whimper most days. But who has time for that, right? So, but the key is to not make it a lifestyle, because that's not healthy. And it might actually make your pain worse, because the more aware you are of how you feel, both physically and emotionally, it gets a lot of attention. And when I'm tense, my pain is worse. But I think one key is to pay attention to if you find yourself starting to say, I shouldn't feel this because, and then the next step is usually there are people worse off in life and so on. And that kind of continues my previous statement about all your feelings are valid. Like, let's face it, if I compared myself to somebody who's homeless or a refugee in the Sudan who isn't getting enough food and whose child is desperately sick, I am just fine, right? So never mind the comparison game, because it gets us nowhere. And you have a right to feel bad. And so maybe if you find yourself saying that statement about I shouldn't feel this way because, maybe the other statement you should ask yourself is, why won't I give myself permission to feel bad or to feel upset? And sure, there are days where you have to repress it in order because you have things to do. But if you have the time, this is one of my most important coping styles, other than repression, is I call it having a swish. And I'm obviously a big believer in not wallowing in misery, which sounds judgmental, but I don't mean it that way. I'm Scandinavian, and we don't believe in feelings, which is mostly a joke, but also not quite wrong, because we live in a culture, like especially the Western culture, that I'm aware of. I don't know the intricacies of other cultures, but Western culture is really only socially acceptable. I almost said sexually acceptable. That's not what I meant. Socially acceptable to express positive feelings, like you're proud of someone, you love someone, you had a good day. That's so socially acceptable. But the other side of the coin of that is that it's not really acceptable to express when you're having a rough time. When you're upset or sad, you're supposed to keep it to yourself. It is culturally valued to keep soldiering on. Like, how many times have you heard somebody say, oh, I'm so impressed because I know you're in pain and you always have a smile on your face? Or, I once heard somebody tell me a story about somebody who lived with untreated RA. This is back in the past. And yet always had a kind word and a smile on her face. And I'm like, you know what? Yes, it's impressive. And yes, let's have a standing ovation for all of us who get through life anyway. But when it gets to the point that you feel silenced about how you feel, that's the problem, right? Like, I'm fond of saying nobody's going to ever give you a medal for being quiet about how you feel. So there's time and place to share that, right? I think we are all... Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked. The Swish thing is coming. We're all aware that there is a self-pity pool, right? And I think a lot of us try to avoid staying there permanently because it's not, well, it's not a fun place to be, for one, right? But so I think this coping skill about repression and soldiering on and keeping going without talking about how crappy you feel is a coping skill, because there's almost a fear of giving into it, because, and I've been in this place, I'm sure you have too, that you're afraid that if you start talking or start crying, you won't be able to stop. Have you ever been there? Um, but our lives is often objectively crappy, and there are legit reasons to feel upset or sad. So, and this is the point where I like to take a swish. And I know it took me a while to get here, but as Mark Twain once said, I didn't have time to write short, so I wrote long. I was just trying to get my notes together. So having a swish is basically taking a moment to yourself and having a good swish in the self-pity pool. You can do it alone. You can do it with somebody that you trust and who will hold your hand through it. And you cry. You give in to this feeling of feeling sorry for yourself. So you have a good cry. You bawl your eyes out. You wail. You can get loud if you want to. Maybe not in the frozen foods aisle in the supermarket, but certainly in the privacy of your home or your car. If you want to say or scream, it's not fair, do it, because you're right. It's not fair. And then when you feel yourself kind of slowing down a bit, get out of the self-pity pool. And that's what I call having a swish. And it helps. Because in my experience, once I've expressed these feelings, that's when I can start thinking constructively about what to do next. Because if I don't express those feelings and get them out, they get in the way of thinking clearly and talking clearly, right? So having a swish is about acknowledging your feelings, taking care of your feelings, and yourself, and basically understanding that we have a mind-body connection that can both help us, but it can also hurt us if we are not giving it the attention it needs. So when's the last time you gave yourself permission to feel sorry for yourself? Like full on. What happened? Tell us, because some people out there might feel encouraged to actually, for once, let go. And I promise you, you will be able to stop. Like if that's what holds you back, it's like I have so many tears, I will never stop. You will stop. And you might feel better for it. I think it's kind of, the saying about having a good cry, which I don't understand, because when I cry, I feel awful. For a couple of days, I get a headache, my nose gets blocked, I look like I'm all red and blotchy. It's not a good cry for me. But for those, I express it in other ways. I usually swear a lot and talk a lot. So we all have different ways to express it. So do whatever you want. So acknowledging your feelings is an important tool. It helps you. Well, it's the first step in kind of realizing that there is a problem. And once you realize the problem and you've expressed the feelings, you can then identify what maybe the next steps are, which can be very simple. We're going to get to that in a minute. No, we're going to get to that now, according to my notes. Oh, don't you love when I'm live? I'm so... there is a flow, but I can sidetrack. Anyway, for instance, one example of this is I used to pre-biologics. I used to see a psychiatrist for therapy, because I believe in the power of therapy. I've had it several times throughout my life, currently having it to deal with pandemic anxiety. But back then it was to learn to deal with pain and function better with pain. And it was tremendously helpful. This was during a time when nothing helped. And it was really tremendously helpful. And at a certain point, I got to a place where I didn't need to go see him every 2 weeks, but I would go back for what I called a refresher every 3 months, 2, 3 months or so. And I still remember this moment when I was on my way to see him for my latest refresher. And I still remember exactly where I was as I'm, I didn't walking, well, in my chair, but walking towards his clinic. And all of a sudden I stopped and I went, wait a minute. If my RA is difficult to cope with, then I don't need to see a psychiatrist. I need to see a rheumatologist. And that was like such a moment for me, because sometimes it's about knowing who should you see, who is the problem, who is the answer to your problem, or may help you get one step further down the road. And I went to my rheumatologist. I made an appointment to see her, and she helped me. So I got long story short. So, but it's definitely a learned skill, this whole acknowledge your feeling, identify the problem, realize what the next steps are. When your daily life requires you to grin and bear it, by necessity, you're avoiding your feelings, right? You're repressing your feelings because otherwise you would never do anything, right? So let's talk about figuring out how to acknowledge and process your feelings. And I'm going to see if there's any new questions. Yes, there are. So I'm just going to dive into the comments briefly before I move on. So Janet says, yes, I agree with you completely. We're stronger than sometimes we think. And she's had the same thoughts. Susie says it's healthy to be honest with yourself about your feelings and to feel them. The key is to figure out how to not get stuck in a negative cycle. It's so important to vent. And absolutely, right? Because I think we get so used to just moving forward, and that we forget that in order to move forward effectively, sometimes you got to kind of stop and check in and process and express, right? Express your feelings, that is. Janet also says, my husband says to me all the time, you hide your pain so well that people just don't think you're in so much pain. Because I don't look sick, and I tend to be a positive person who tries to show kindness and compassion to others, even when I'm hurting. Well, yes, right? Because you create a life around your pain. So you focus on that, usually around other people. And it's just necessary. Otherwise, you don't have a life. And Janet also says, I think it's vitally important to have a person that you feel safe talking to about how you feel. Just someone that listens is so important. Absolutely. And whether that's someone in your family, a friend, or someone who gets paid to listen is also fine. Then therapy, because that can, especially if you feel that your kind of assessment and motivation skills are rusty, a therapist can be an excellent sounding board and kind of help you move through that process of getting ready to find out what kind of other help you might need. But let's talk about how to keep pushing. So I have two instincts that work really well in difficult situations. And so it's kind of amusing. Anyway, the first is kind of an instinct statement, whatever. It's basically, you're not the boss of me. I am sometimes very terrible twos, and my approach is like, no, you don't get to say, you don't get to decide what happens to me, which I think is partly where like my family is like that. But I think it's also from spending years in hospitals when I was a child and a teenager where other people were in control of me. But this kind of, you're not the boss of me, I usually apply it to my body, which is not nice to my body. But let's say I apply it to the RA, right? sometimes to health professionals, sometimes to those infamous service in quotation mark professionals who are supposed to, who get paid to help and yet don't, um, and who may have ideas about what I should be doing, right? The second is we joke this is genetic in my family. The I'll show the bastards. You tell me I can't do something, and I will drive myself into the ground, showing you that I can indeed do something. And it's everybody who knows me is very well acquainted with this tendency in me. I was talking to David, aka the boy, the other day, and he said, he's my partner, and he said he's very well aware of it, and he would never do it because he knows that it's, and I quote, the nuclear version, and or nuclear options. So he would never tell me I can't do it. But if he feels that I really need some help in getting motivated, he might say that. This is what he said. He never has done it yet, but he might have said, like, yeah, somebody else think you can't do it. And it's like, well, let me show you, right? So do you have one of those, I guess, sayings that illustrates your stubbornness and how you keep going? Let me know, because I just think it's funny. But the problem is it can be really difficult to access that stubbornness. Sorry, I had something else to share that I apparently deleted out of my notes because, okay, never mind. That's for another day then. But it can be really difficult to access that stubbornness when you've had a really long time of nothing working. People who live with chronic illness are pretty resilient because, again, we've had to become resilient and we've learned the hard way. But even after a while, when you have tried everything that's ever worked before, probably more than once, and nothing helps, it can really, like, you end up feeling helpless and hopeless, and then there's no point. It really feels like there's no point, right? And all you want to do is curl up in a ball and give up. And for me, it's about finding the why, the WHY. Like, why do you keep going? Why don't you give up? Why do you get out of bed on difficult days? And for me, very related to my two statements of stubbornness is I learned from my parents, both of whom had medical issues of their own, that giving up is not an option. And that's what I grew up with. And like, let's face it, of course, it's seriously an option for everyone. You always have the choice to stop going. But having that whole giving up is not an option in me, that's something, that's sometimes the only thing that gets me going and helps keep me going. I have a friend who, about 20 years ago, had a severe suicidal depression, and she would wake up every day disappointed that she was still alive. But what kept her from doing anything about it was her children, because she was very aware she couldn't do that to her kids, which helped her to stay alive long enough that she could get treatment and get better, and she's fine. So I think we each find our own why. Like, why are you getting out of bed? Why do you keep going when things are hard? So if you're willing, please share your why in the comments, because it might help somebody who if somebody stumbles on this live at some point in the future, it might help them to read the comments and see why you keep going, and it might help kind of help them find their own why. Only if you feel comfortable sharing it publicly, of course. Anyway, so as I said, I have the giving up. See, I mess with my notes. This is the problem. I write notes and then I riff and then I get ahead of myself. But when I was in the depths of that terrible RA flare, my why was that medication was coming. that something was happening. I was just waiting for this funding. And at a certain point, my why, my reason to keep going was that I'd given myself permission to do something about it in June, and it wasn't June yet, so I had to keep going. Like, it can get pretty demented in your brain when you're really struggling, but whatever keeps you going, right? In retrospect, like I've said before, I should obviously have talked to my doctors while I was in the middle of this hell, but I didn't. So, so that's something I kind of want you to keep in mind if you're having a really bad time. Is there's hope. If you feel so lost that it doesn't occur to you that somebody out there might help you, do it anyway. Ask for help. Trust that, like, if you have reached the end of your rope, trust that someone else have extra rope they can give you. And, talk to your doctor, ideally before it gets that bad. But if you are in that situation, talk to your doctor. If your doctor's not listening, talk to another one of your doctors. Talk to a family member, talk to a friend, talk to a priest, a therapist. Call a hotline if you're feeling suicidal. Reach out. And I think if there's anything that really terrible time in my life taught me, is always trust that someone else can help. And one of the dangers of that level of depression and hopelessness is that you are convinced that people can't help. And that is the lie that depression tells you, is that you don't, that there is no option, that there is no hope. And I think that's the one you have to hold on to, is that that's a lie. Yes, there is hope. The question is finding the person who can get you that little bit further, right? And it feels like you're alone, but you aren't. Even if you're living away from the people you love the best, somebody out there may get paid to help you, and there's nothing wrong with that. So just remember that one. So just want to dive into the comments again. That's it for my prepared remarks. Janet again, her statement is, "Oh yeah, well, watch me," which is very, very much like, I forget what mine was. There was, "I'll show the bastards." Whoops. I'll show you the bastard statement that is very similar to mine, and there's nothing quite as motivating, right? Janet also says, "Lonely is another feeling. This pandemic has certainly not been easy to stay positive." Oh no. Oh, very much no. And I think especially when you're high risk for complications or worse with COVID. And I saw somebody tweet the other day that what made them, that they thought that the way people behave during the pandemic has made them far more anxious than the actual pandemic. And I think there is that, because every day finding out that you're not important, your life is not important enough for someone to put on a mask or get a vaccine, is difficult. And I got myself a therapist about a year ago, which has helped. It doesn't take away the fact that it's difficult and anxious and frustrating and lonely and all of that, but it helps a little. By the way, before I move on to the next comment, if you have any topics that you want me to talk about, let me know in the comments, because I can add them to future lives. And I should also mention that you see the black blob on my bed. That is Maud. She is not a new cat to this household, but she's now allowed in here because Lucy, well, as you know, Lucy died. So took her a while. It's taken her about 3 or 5 months, 3 months, 4 months almost, to get to the point where she's lying on my bed, which is nice to have a cat in here again. Yeah, it's that fighting spirit. Back to the topic at hand. It's that fighting spirit some of us has that just refuses to believe that we can't do something. Yeah, and I think it's definitely something you can grow. It's fighting spirit you can grow, and I think it's difficult when you're first diagnosed, um, because so much of living with chronic illness is about figuring out how to live with chronic illness. And when you're new, it's not that you don't have the fighting spirit, because I'm quite sure all of it has some level of fighting spirit in some area. Like if you're a single parent, you certainly have a fighting spirit. If you've been working frontline during a pandemic, you are certainly fighting spirit, right? But these new situations is about learning how to do that. Um, and some of it had been like that since we were little, much to the disappointment of our parents, no doubt. But it actually, like a stubborn child, has coping skills that become a well functioning adult, usually. Susie says that my mantra is that I will not go down without a fight. I've also learned that when the blues come, I only give myself the day to feel that way, and then it's time to fight again and do what I can to move forward. Exactly. You take a swish, right? It is about giving yourself that time limited area where you can absolutely give in to feeling really sad and upset, and then you move on. Brilliant. Susie goes on to say, I try my best to concentrate on what I can still do instead of what I can't do. I've had RA for 44 years, most of my life, so I learned over time how to cope. And I do the exact same thing. About it, it's about that shift of focus and looking at what you can do and what you do every day. Because the minute you start looking at what you can't do, the depression just comes trotting along with it, and it requires a certain level of vigilance, I find. Janet says, I go into my guest bedroom and look at my wheelchair and say to it, I hope you like sitting in here because that's where you're staying for a long time. I'm in physical therapy and work so hard to keep my mobility. I know one day I may need my wheelchair every day, but as long as I can fight it, I will. And I think that's brilliant. Like whatever keeps you going. Just one note. If you do end up needing your wheelchair, try to see it as a tool because I think for many people, when they get to the point when they need a mobility aid, there's this whole perception that it's giving up or surrendering. So that's a hard word, apparently. Surrendering, like to the point where even your doctor might say, oh, no, you don't need that. And it's like, no, I think there are certain points in our lives where a mobility aid can actually lessen pain and increase energy. So whatever you need at whatever stage, just be generous with yourself should that time come. But other than that, I completely understand. I have a bit of the same, obviously not with a wheelchair because I need that every day, but with certain other things, it's like, yeah, that day might come, but it's not here yet. And I'm going to fight I'm going to fight a lot to not get there because you have to, right? Lori, hello, Lori, says, it was imperative for me to find a purpose every day, and prayer was vital. I think that's great. And I think it is about that sense of purpose. And it doesn't matter what it is. Like for some, like you, prayer is really important for during that really difficult time in my life. One of the things that kept me going was I had a cat named Mojo who needed me to take care of her. And that's what kept me moving. So I kept some of my ability and strength, not much, granted, but it kept me going, right? And for others, it's their kids, or for some others, it's being the matriarch of the family, the one people turn to when they need someone to listen. That's a good purpose too. What's your purpose? What keeps you going? Like, what's your why or your purpose in your days. I'd love to hear that as well. Um, and Janet, one last comment. Janet says, oh, about the wheelchair. She says, I know I'll need an energy use it when it much like walk a long way due to the fact I can't. Yeah, like I think it's saying you say my wheelchair says it's sit down and let me help you when you have to walk a long way. And I think that's a wonderful way to look at it, because we're back to it being a tool, right? It is a tool that can help, but you also know that, and you will allow it to be a tool that can help, but only when you need it, right? And I think it's often knowing the balance between when you need it and when you don't. And it sounds like you found that, and I think that's brilliant. Good for you. And I have, anyway, so let's see. Okay, I have a couple of interesting comments out there that I don't know. Spam, probably. Anyway, so that's me. Thank you so much for joining me in this, and I'm going to go have a cup of tea. Oops, sorry. And do some other stuff. And sorry, I had my glide point on the spacebar. That shouldn't do that. Anyway, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. And if you're watching this after I was live, again, thank you. Feel free to leave a comment and participate. And I'll keep hovering and those comments, and we can keep talking. Thank you. Have a great day.